The United States really started out as part of an imperial power. Then we gained our independence, and since then, the United States, we really just kind of stuck to ourselves. Or did we? That's what we're going to take a look at today in this video on Mr. E's Classroom. Hey ladies and gentlemen, Mr. E here. Today we're going to take a look at the roots of American imperialism. The question we're really going to focus in on in this video is why and how did the U.S. take a more active role in world affairs? So what exactly is imperialism? Imperialism is when a stronger nation extends some kind of control over a weaker nation. Usually that's done either through politics, could be through military, or even through economics. Why exactly would the U.S. want to get more involved in this imperialism game? Well, the short and easy answer is the U.S. needed to extend more influence throughout the world to be able to be more powerful and to compete with bigger European powers. Back at the turn of the 20th century, there was this saying that the sun never sat on the British Empire. Basically what that meant was the British had influence all over the world. At any given point, they controlled somewhere where the sun was up. The idea was that if the British Empire got to be so big and powerful, why couldn't the United States be this big and powerful as well? And to really help kind of push this point, even tiny European countries like Portugal and Belgium, they got a piece of this empire action also. The United States was a heck of a lot bigger than Portugal or Belgium, so if they get to be an imperial power, why is the United States not an imperial power? So aside from wanting to be a big and bad force in the world, what really caused the United States to get into imperialism? There's three main things. The first one is economic benefits of being an imperialistic power. The second is military strength. And the third is to show national superiority. Let's dive into those real quick. Economic benefits. Really what that meant for the United States was new markets. We had been producing all sorts of goods, and we've done a pretty good job up to this point of selling those goods in-house to people here in the United States. By the end of the 1800s, though, we've kind of maxed out that market. We've sold just about everything we can sell to the people that live here. We really needed to find a new outlet for all the things that we were producing. To kind of really push this point, I want to introduce this quote by a guy named Alfred Mahan. We'll talk a little bit more about him here in just a second. Mahan said, "Whether they will or will not, Americans must now begin to look outward. The growing production of the country demands it." Basically what Mahan's saying is that we have to go somewhere else besides the United States, or else we're gonna just kind of screw ourselves over. Speaking of Mahan, the second real reason for us getting into the imperial game dealt with military strength. Back at the turn of the 20th century, the idea was if you had a big, strong navy, you had a big, strong nation. Unfortunately for us, we did not have a very big navy at the turn of the 20th century. A guy in the Navy named Admiral Alfred Mahan, the same Mahan that I just gave you a quote from, he wrote a pretty influential book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. That book came out in 1890. Basically what Mahan said in his book was that if you go back and you look at all the big important empires of history, the Greeks, the Romans, those kind of guys, the one thread that they had in common amongst all of them was they all had a very powerful navy of some sort. Mahan argued that if we wanted to be on the same level as some of those guys, we had to have a big fleet ourselves. We needed also to have a modern fleet. And to go along with that modern fleet, we needed to have some sort of foreign bases to be able to refuel these ships that we're going to build. Basically, it was why pay anybody else for our gas if we could just go out and build some gas stations around the world that we already own? Based on what Mahan was arguing, by 1900 the U.S. had the world's third largest navy. That's pretty impressive considering we weren't really even on the chart in 1890 when he first wrote his book. Reason number three for wanting to get involved in imperialism dealt with a thing called national superiority. Back in the day, there's this idea called social Darwinism. It kind of was a play on Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. Under social Darwinism, basically was the belief that certain races or nations were superior to others and therefore they were destined to be able to rule over them. Back in the day, a guy named Reverend Josiah Strong came out with this idea that he thought that white race had a responsibility to civilize and Christianize the rest of the world. The United States, at the time being majority white, kind of started to buy into this. This idea that the white race was the superior race was not just a United States thing. I'm going to read you a poem real quick by a guy named Rudyard Kipling. Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folken wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. This comes from a poem that Kipling wrote called The White Man's Burden. For those of you who know who Kipling is, Rudyard Kipling is pretty famous for something else he wrote called The Jungle Book. Kipling was British. Basically what Kipling's trying to say in his poem, The White Man's Burden here, is that the white man is almost sacrificing himself to go out and try to help the rest of these people around the world to be civilized. That was kind of one of the main tenets of this idea of imperialization. Another way to look at it is to kind of take a look at this cartoon that came from a magazine called Judge back at the turn of the 20th century. If you look at this cartoon, you notice two figures basically carrying a bunch of people up to the top of this mountain, and at the top there's a kind of a statue called Civilization. Leading the pack is actually a pictorial representation of the British Empire, and closely followed behind is our own Uncle Sam. Kind of take a look at the people that they're carrying. You see some Asian people, you see some Middle Eastern people, you see some African people. The idea was that our great Western civilizations were better than anybody else, and it was our job to help them get to the top, to civilization. So what were America's kind of first steps towards being an imperial power? Well, to answer that question, we need to talk about Matthew Perry. No, not that Matthew Perry. This guy, Commodore Matthew Perry. Because in 1853, he traveled to Japan. Back then, Japan was totally closed off from the rest of the world. When Perry showed up in Tokyo Bay, people were kind of mesmerized by these newfangled ships they had. In fact, they called them dragons puffing smoke. Perry convinced the Japanese to open their borders and to trade almost exclusively with the United States. The way he did this was basically to impress the Emperor of Japan with all sorts of lavish gifts and some pretty veiled threats of, if you don't do this, I'm going to take my smoking dragons over here and show you who's boss. This got the United States a definite presence over in the Pacific, especially close to Asia. The second major step we took towards being an imperial power was to buy Canada's tail. Some people would call that Alaska. In 1867, we purchased Alaska from the Russians for $7.2 million. Now, that sounds like it might be a ton of money, but when you look at how much land we got for $7.2 million, it was a pretty big deal. It actually doubled the size of the United States. At the time, a lot of people referred to this as Seward's Folly or Seward's Icebox, after Secretary of State William Seward, the guy who kind of put together the deal. What most people didn't realize at the time was how valuable Alaska would be for all the resources were there. Not only is there a lot of oil in Alaska, there's also a ton of gold and things like timber and mineral resources. It turned out to be a pretty good bargain. The final major step towards the United States becoming an imperial power was the annexation of Hawaii. Back in the 1800s, Hawaii was actually its own country. It was a kingdom. They had a king and a palace and all that stuff. The United States had been using Hawaii for years as kind of a stopping point for going to Asia. It had been settled by missionaries. They'd set up a bunch of churches and schools. There's also a very large, white, mostly American population that owned a lot of plantations in Hawaii, mostly sugarcane plantations. And things were going along just fine until the United States decided to slap a tariff on sugar imports. This kind of got the ball rolling on the annexation of the Hawaiian Islands. So I already mentioned the sugar tariffs that plantation owners had to deal with in Hawaii. The other main thing that really kind of got the ball rolling on the annexation of Hawaii was when Queen Leleakalani took the throne in 1891. She was what we would call a Hawaiian nationalist. She firmly believed in kind of the Hawaiian people. Hawaii before then had a constitution that was very, shall we say, white man friendly. Leleakalani's brother, the former king, was kind of in their pockets. When he dies, Leleakalani takes the throne. One of her first acts was to do away with the Hawaiian Constitution as it was written. Basically, she axed all the parts of it that gave the white minority its power. It started to return the power to the Hawaiian native people. The tariffs plus the nationalist queen eventually led to what we would refer to as a coup d'etat. Coup d'etat is a fancy word that just means that a sudden, sometimes violent, overthrow of a government by a relatively small group of people. In this case, it was the minority white plantation owners. They just could not stand not being able to make money off of their plantations. So in 1893, what happened is the white plantation owners asked for some favors from the U.S. government. That favor was actually some U.S. Marine troops to come and overthrow the queen. A guy named Sanford Dole kind of takes up the reins as the new president of Hawaii. His first act as the president of Hawaii is to actually go and ask the United States, hey, make us one of your territories. In 1898, that process begins and Hawaii becomes annexed or brought in to be an official U.S. territory. One of the good things that happens for the plantation owners is now that Hawaii is part of the United States, they don't have to worry about the tariffs on their sugarcane. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, here are a few takeaways from this video. Number one, remember that imperialism is a way for the U.S. to really extend its influence around the world and really and truly compete with European powers. Number two, imperialism is really all about economic benefits, military strength, and national superiority. Lastly, number three, the United States gobbled up Hawaii as its first real imperial territory. There you go, guys, the roots of American imperialism. Hopefully your notes are going to be good so you do well on the quiz that'll happen in class. And as always, until next time, ladies and gentlemen, remember, don't ever stop learning.